What's up guys, Matt the Riff Master here. So today we're going to be discussing different string gauges and different tunings. So guys, as we all know, there are multiple different string gauges out there, loads of different tunings that you can have. So I thought I would discuss today and give you my thoughts on string gauges and tunings and what gauges are best for what tunings, because a lot of people have asked me this in the comments before. So I thought I would address this topic and hopefully help some of you out with your decisions and your queries when it comes to string gauges and tunings. So in this video, I'm probably just going to stick to the more basic kind of tunings. Probably won't go down to the depths of like drop A and drop fucking Oblivion and all that kind of stuff. So I'll kind of keep it basic for you and give you a general idea of how it all kind of works. So let's start off with the string gauges. You got 9 gauge, you got 10 gauge, you got 11s, you got 12s. Okay, so most of you are probably more familiar with 9s, 10s, and 11s. So for example, 9 gauges, which you will see comes in a lovely pink packet right here. I personally, 9s I would probably put for standard tuning, so E to E, just because of the tension with it, with those strings in that tuning would just feel right. I think dropping anything, even a half step down with 9s, I guess you could, but I personally wouldn't advise it just because I think it would just be too loose. Even though it is half a step, you may be able to compensate that by adjusting the truss rod, maybe a little bit of a setup arrangement. But I think 9 gauge strings are best left in standard tuning. I mean, 8 gauge. There is an 8 gauge, which, to be honest, I never really thought existed at one point. 8 gauge strings. I think Billy Gibbons goes for the old 8 gauges. And I think he might have his in E flat. I'm not sure. But he is Billy Gibbons. But it is possible. But anything lower than standard tuning and E flat with 9 gauge strings is a bit of a push. A bit of a push. Because if you go too low, basically if you go too low tuning with a light gauge of string, it's just going to be all flappy. It's not going to sound great. It's not going to stay in tune, and it's just not going to be a very pleasant experience. So moving up to 10 gauge strings, 10 to 46, the ones in a beautiful lime green packet here. These ones for me, when I use these strings, I'm usually in standard tuning, so again E to E, or I will go a half step down because I feel that 10 gauges, the 10 to 46 can handle dropping half a step down. Anything lower than half a step down, I wouldn't go to with that gauge of strings. So again, E standard and E flat. So if you don't know what E flat is, it's literally just from your standard tuning to half a step down. So you're not quite going a full step, it's just half a step. Also with the 10 gauge, the 10 to 46, you can drop it to drop D. So that lower string, dropping it all the way down to a D. It works, and then leaving the rest in standard tuning, just dropping that low string. The string gauge is good enough to be able to hold that low string being dropped. It doesn't sound too flabby, it doesn't sound too rubbish, so you're all good to go if you want to drop that lower string. So now let's move on to 11 gauge, 11 to 48s, which you see here in a beautiful purple packet. So 11 to 48s for me, this is what I use lately. I've had a set of 11s on my ESP in standard tuning in E to E. And that has felt really good in that tuning. I don't think I've ever done it before. When I've used these strings, I've normally just stuck to E flat, so half a step down. But recently, when I did my Unforgiven 3 cover, I put the 11s on and I put it in standard, and it felt great. There was like the perfect amount of tension with that tuning, and I just felt like you just hit a chord and it just felt big and it felt tight. So entirely up to you, but for me with 11s, I'll put it in standard. Obviously you do need to make, actually we'll go on to that point afterwards, okay? So stick around. 11s, standard tuning, half a step down, so all the strings half a step down, and again, dropping that lower string will be fine as well. You could probably, at a push, take the 11 gauges a whole step down, so the whole guitar tuned a whole step down, so in D standard, I believe. Yep, that's the one. Yeah, it is doable, but again, with some setup and truss rod adjustments, you could probably make it work. I think I remember once that I had a set of 11s on my snake bite, and I think I tuned it down to B, like all the way, like full on drop B. Obviously adjusted the truss rod and all that, and it actually worked, but that was a bit difficult. So I wouldn't advise going that low with the 11s, but standard, half a step down, dropping the lower string, and potentially going a whole step down with all the strings is doable with the 11 to 48s. Okay, so one more gauge that I'm going to touch on that I use is great for those of you guys that want to go to like drop C sharp or drop C, or even going a whole step down and feeling comfortable having enough tension on them strings, and that is the Beefy Slinky set, which is right here, which is 11 to 54. So these strings I've used a lot for a lot of my drop tune covers. The Volbeat one I did, but Warrior's cool. The other Volbeat ones I did. But anything that's dropped down, like quite low, the Beefy Slinkies are great strings because you've got enough flexibility on the higher strings, but it's a little bit thicker on the lower strings, so it holds that tension. Because if you're dropping it, like, you know, if you're going all the way down to D, a whole step down, the whole guitar a whole step down, you're going to want that tension on the strings so it doesn't sound too flappy. So with these strings, I will go to drop C sharp or D standard. I wouldn't put these strings in like E standard. That would be, strings would be way too tight, too much tension. They might even snap. It wouldn't feel great. So yeah, mainly D standard, drop C sharp, something a little bit lower, but nothing down to the depths of really low. Because again, you want to keep the tension on them strings just so the notes ring out and it's not too flabby and it's not going like this all over the place. So guys, there are a few examples of string gauges that I use and what the tunings that I use those strings in. Everybody's going to be different, obviously, but these are the strings that I personally use and the tunings that I use. But do be aware that when you are doing something like this, so if you, for example, if you've got a set of 10 gauges on your guitar, you're in standard tuning, and one day you think, oh, I want to do D standard, I want to go a whole step down. You don't want to keep those 10 gauge strings on and tune all the way down, okay? That's one very important thing to remember, is to not take the string gauge you have, and if you want to go to a tuning that does require a higher gauge string, to not just use the ones you have. Think about it, because if you put 10 gauges in D standard, things will just be too loose, too flappy. When you're playing, it'll be messy. I found if you're in a low tuning with the wrong gauge strings, everything gets really messy and notes aren't defined. It's just all flabby and it's rattling everywhere. It's not a good move. So always make sure that you get the right gauges for the tuning that you want to do. And hopefully the examples I gave in this video will help you out when it comes to making that decision. And one other thing to remember is when you are changing your string gauge, so if you went from a 10 gauge set to 11 to 50, what is it, 54 to 11 to 54, doing that big jump between 10 gauge and 11 to 54 onto your guitar, you're going to need to make some truss rod adjustments. So, because there's going to be different tension on the fret on the neck. So if you go from the 10 gauge, you string up with the 11 to 54s, you start tightening it, it's going to start moving the neck. So that's one thing to be aware of, is making that truss rod adjustment to accommodate for the new set of strings and the heavier gauge strings that you have. Also intonation, you may need to do some intonation changes when you're doing a different string gauge, lower tuning. So if you went from E standard to D standard, truss rod adjustments, intonation, just a general little setup will help and be beneficial to accommodate that tuning, those heavier strings, to keep you in tune, keep the strings feeling good, and generally the guitar feeling good when you're playing. Because sometimes if you put a heavier gauge on your guitar and you start tuning it, it will start to bring the neck up like that, and then there'll be the whole distance between the strings and the fretboard, which can be a whole different video if you guys want to see that, about string height and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, just be wary of that it's not just as simple as putting new strings on and ready to go. You will need to make adjustments to your guitar to accommodate for those strings. So one more thing that I will touch on is custom gauges. You can mix and match. So what you get in the packet, you don't necessarily need to have it like that. You can mix and match gauges. So for example, if you're in a low tuning and you want, because when you're in a low tuning, the string gauges are very thick, there's a nice amount of tension. But for example, if you're a lead player, you're going to want the heavier strings from that packet on the bottom, okay? So you've got that chunk, you've got that nice tight rhythm. But on the higher end for your solos, you may not want that heavier gauge because it will just shred your fingers to pieces, especially if you're gigging. You're doing a tour, you do one gig and your fingers are just ruined for the tour. So what you could do is you could take the last 3 strings, the higher strings, from a lighter gauge and put them on your guitar with that lower gauge. Does that make sense? So then you can tune it up, so when it comes to all your lead playing, all the bends, you can get all those big bends, you're in tune, but you're not tearing your fingers apart with the heavier gauge all the way through the guitar. Does that make sense? I hope that does. If there's any questions on it, just let me know. But yeah, it's pretty simple. It's just mixing the gauges because like I said, you don't want to be shredding like a madman on a heavy gauge. Some people can do it. I mean, Zakk Wylde, that man's got fingers of like just steel. But if you do want to feel more comfortable with all your bends and your shredding, you can go for a lighter gauge on the higher strings if you so wish to do so. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it helped some of you out with some of your queries and questions about string gauges and tunings. Like I said, these are the strings that I use and the tunings that I use for them. Let me know down below what kind of setup you like, what gauge you like to play with, what tunings you like to put them in. There's loads of different like tunings out there and some other string gauges out there that we could maybe touch on another time. But like I said, I just wanted to touch on the ones that I use in my playing daily and whenever I do anything that I do around here. So guys, if you've got any more questions, stick it in the comments below. I will be happy to answer them to the best of my ability. And yeah, comment below, like, all that cool stuff. If you're new, hit that subscribe button, come and hang out, all that cool stuff. And as always, guys, rock out, be awesome, and I will see you very soon. See ya!